They didn't raise their voices. They didn't look at my son when they did it. At a packed fundraiser, my aunt smiled into a microphone and announced which next-generation leaders would be supported by the family's business moving forward. Applause filled the room. Names were read. My son's wasn't. Then she added, lightly, some kids just aren't built for responsibility. My son's phone was still recording when the clapping started. It was a charity fundraiser, the kind where everyone dresses one step nicer than they're comfortable with and pretends it's about the cause instead of the seating chart. Crystal glasses, string lights, a rented banquet hall in Naperville that smelled faintly like lemon cleaner and catered chicken. My Aunt Linda and Uncle Robert were hosting, standing near the stage like proud executives instead of retirees who'd been lucky with timing and property values. My son, Ethan, stood next to me near the back. He'd insisted on coming even though I told him he didn't have to. He said it would be good for him to practice being normal, which was his phrase lately, the one he used when he felt like he was always a step off from everyone else. He wore a borrowed blazer that pinched at the shoulders and kept smoothing his hair like it might suddenly betray him. I'm going to record it, he said quietly, holding up his phone before the program started. For my civics class. We have to document a community event. I nodded and smiled because that's what I do. I don't discourage hope, even when experience tells me to. The room filled fast. My cousins clustered near the front with their kids, all confidence and straight posture and easy laughter. The younger ones darted between tables like they owned the place. Ethan stayed where he was, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes scanning for exits like he always did in crowds. Linda took the microphone after dinner, tapping it once like she knew exactly how loud she was allowed to be. The room quieted. She smiled, the kind of smile that's practiced in mirrors and perfected over decades of being listened to. We're so grateful you're all here tonight, she said. This family has always believed in giving back, and in investing in the future. People nodded. Glasses clinked. Someone coughed. Robert stepped beside her, one hand resting on the podium like it belonged to him. Tonight we also want to recognize the next generation, he said. The kids who will carry this family's values forward. Ethan straightened just a little. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but I did. I always do. They started reading names. My cousin Mark's daughter, praised for her leadership program. My cousin Jenna's son, commended for his internship at a firm his dad's friend ran. Each name came with applause. Warm and generous, like encouragement cost nothing. Ethan held his phone steady. I watched the screen catch the stage, the smiles, the clapping hands. His thumb hovered near the edge, careful not to block the lens. Linda glanced down at her notes, then back up. Of course, she said lightly, not every child is suited for responsibility at this level. There was a pause. Just a half beat. Enough for the sentence to land. Some kids need a different kind of support, she continued. And that's okay. The room laughed. Softly. Relieved laughter. The kind people make when they're glad they weren't named. No one said Ethan's name. No one needed to. His phone dipped for just a second, then steadied again. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at anyone. He stared straight ahead, face blank in a way I recognized immediately. The way kids look when they decide feeling something is too dangerous. Applause rose again as Linda moved on, already talking about tax incentives and community partnerships. The moment was over for everyone else. For us, it had just begun. I didn't stand up. I didn't say anything. I didn't confront them or storm out. That's never been my style, and they knew it. They counted on it. I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the one that comes when you realize you've just watched a line get crossed in public, on purpose, and with witnesses. The kind of line people pretend not to see later. I leaned slightly toward Ethan. You okay? I asked quietly. He nodded too fast. Yeah, he said. I'm fine. It was the same answer he'd given for years. We stayed until the end because leaving would have made it a thing, and my family loves to call reactions overreactions. Ethan kept recording, even when his hands started to shake. When the lights came up and people began milling around, someone clapped Robert on the back and said, "Great night." Another said, "You must be so proud." Proud of what? I wondered. Of control? Of knowing exactly who belonged and who didn't. On the drive home, Ethan was quiet. Streetlights flickered across his face as he stared out the window. About halfway there, he spoke. I guess they're right, he said, voice flat. I'm not really leadership material. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. Who told you that? He shrugged. They didn't have to. Everyone knows. I didn't argue with him. Not then. I'd learned the hard way that you can't talk someone out of a wound while it's still bleeding. So I waited. I let the silence stretch until it felt heavy enough to say something honest. They don't get to decide who you are. I said finally. He nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe me yet. That night, after he went to bed, I sat at my kitchen table and replayed the video on his phone. I watched Linda smile. I listened to the words again, stripped of laughter and background noise, clear and unmistakable. Not suited. Different kind of support. Phrases designed to sound kind while doing damage. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I did what I've always done when something feels wrong but precise. I paid attention. Because here's the thing about people who are comfortable humiliating a child in public. They assume no one is keeping track. That night brought back a lot of older nights, the kind you don't think about unless something cracks them open. I lay awake listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing on our street, and my brain started lining things up the way it does when it's trying to make sense of patterns it already knows the answer to. My family has always believed in categories. The responsible ones. The promising ones. The ones you make allowances for. It's not something they ever announced outright. It lived in the way questions were asked, the way praise was distributed, the way silence filled the space where someone else's name could have been. I grew up on the wrong side of that line. My mother died when I was in my 20s, and my dad faded out of the picture not long after, leaving my Aunt Linda to step into a role she never officially claimed but fully occupied. She liked to tell people she was practically a second mother to me. What she meant was that she kept an eye on me, the way you watch a pot you don't fully trust not to boil over. I wasn't a problem kid. I didn't get into trouble. I worked part-time through high school, paid my own way through community college, and took whatever job paid consistently. I became a facilities coordinator for a regional logistics company, which sounds more impressive than it is. I keep buildings running. I make sure lights turn on and doors lock and vendors show up when they're supposed to. It's steady work. It suits me. Linda always treated it like a temporary phase I'd somehow overstayed. Have you ever thought about doing more? She'd ask at family gatherings, her tone curious in the way people get when they already know the answer they're hoping you won't give. More, in her vocabulary, meant something with a title people recognized. When Ethan was born, those questions shifted direction. Suddenly it wasn't just about what I hadn't achieved, but what I was failing to set up for him. His father left when Ethan was 3, not dramatically, just gradually, as if distance could be introduced in increments until it felt natural. The family pretended to be sympathetic while quietly recalculating my place in the hierarchy. Single mother. Modest income. No partner with a pedigree. Ethan grew up absorbing that atmosphere without anyone ever spelling it out. Kids are good at that. They notice who gets celebrated and who gets explained away. From early on, he struggled with focus. Teachers wrote phrases like bright but inconsistent and needs redirection in every report card. By 3rd grade, he'd already learned the difference between being praised for effort and being praised for results. One felt like encouragement. The other felt like proof. I got him evaluated when he was 9. ADHD, inattentive type. Not shocking, manageable with structure and patience. We built routines, color-coded calendars, checklists on the fridge. He improved, but improvement never looks impressive from the outside. At family events, Ethan was the sweet one. So polite. Such a gentle soul. No one ever said capable. My cousin's kids, on the other hand, were natural leaders. Even when they were loud or reckless or rude, it was reframed as confidence. They interrupted adults and were called assertive. Ethan waited his turn and was called shy. Linda loved to talk about how important it was to prepare the kids for real life. Real life, according to her, required a certain kind of polish. A certain ease. The ability to walk into a room and make people want to listen. Ethan learned early that rooms made him tired. I tried to shield him from the worst of it. I limited visits. I redirected conversations. I told myself that as long as no one was openly cruel, we could manage. That's the lie you tell yourself when the alternative feels like lighting a match in a room full of family history. The fundraiser stripped that lie down to nothing. It wasn't just what they said, it was how comfortable they were saying it. How sure they were that no one would challenge them. How easily the room followed their lead. The next morning, Ethan didn't want to go to school. I have a presentation today, he said, sitting at the kitchen table with his backpack at his feet. I don't think I can do it. I poured him a bowl of cereal and sat across from him. Why not? He stared at the spoon in his hand. Because if I mess up, it just proves them right. Proves who right? I asked, even though I knew. He shrugged again. Everyone. I took a breath and chose my words carefully. You messing up doesn't prove anything except that you're human. He nodded, but his eyes stayed fixed on the table. I watched him pack his bag, double-checking the same folder 3 times, the way he always did when he was anxious. When he left, I sat there longer than I needed to, staring at the empty chair. At work, I went through the motions. Answered emails, approved invoices, scheduled a roof inspection. My job rewards attention to detail, and that day my mind was unusually sharp. I kept replaying Linda's voice, isolating the phrasing, the pauses. I'd learned over the years that people who choose their words carefully do so for a reason. That afternoon, I got a call from my cousin Jenna. Hey, she said brightly. I just wanted to check in. Things got a little awkward last night. Awkward. That was the word they always used. I thought the event went exactly the way it was planned, I said. There was a pause. You know they didn't mean anything by it. Then what did they mean? I asked. She laughed softly, uncomfortable now. You're reading too much into it. After we hung up, I sat back in my chair and felt something settle. Not anger, not sadness, clarity. People who benefit from a system will always call it a misunderstanding when it's exposed. That evening, Ethan showed me his civics assignment. The video from the fundraiser was uploaded, trimmed, labeled. He'd done exactly what he was supposed to do. Do you want me to delete it? He asked, glancing up at me. I looked at the screen again, At the moment Linda spoke, frozen mid-smile. No, I said. Keep it. He hesitated. Is that okay? Yes, I said, and meant more than just the video. I didn't know yet what I was going to do. I didn't have a plan, but I understood something important for the first time in a long while. They had made their judgment out loud. And I had proof they never expected me to use. Ethan didn't talk about the fundraiser again, at least not directly. He has that habit of filing things away, stacking them neatly somewhere behind his eyes where he thinks they won't get in the way. I know that habit because I taught it to him without meaning to. It's what you learn to do when reacting only makes things worse. What changed was smaller and harder to explain. He started waking up earlier, setting his alarm twice to make sure he didn't miss it. He reread instructions for assignments even when he already understood them. He asked me questions he'd never asked before, not about the work itself, but about how it would be judged. Do you think this looks sloppy? Is this what teachers expect? Should I redo it even if it's technically done? Once, I caught him rewriting a perfectly fine paragraph for the third time. When I told him to stop, he looked at me and said, I just don't want to give them a reason. I knew exactly who they were. His ADHD had always made him move through the world a little differently. He noticed everything but processed it out of order. Sounds overlapped. Thoughts jumped tracks. When he was younger, teachers praised his creativity but complained about his follow-through. By middle school, the praise dried up and the complaints stayed. He wasn't disruptive. He wasn't failing. He was just inconvenient. Too much effort for people who liked neat success stories. At family gatherings, that inconvenience turned into an identity. Linda loved to ask him about school in front of other adults, her voice loud enough to gather an audience. So how are the grades coming along? She'd say, smiling like she was rooting for him. Ethan would answer honestly, which was never the right move. A B in math. A C+ in English because he forgot to turn something in. Linda would nod sympathetically. Well, not everyone's an academic, she'd say, and someone would chuckle like it was a harmless observation. No one ever laughed when one of the other kids underperformed. Their mistakes were off weeks or burnout, or too many commitments. Ethan's were character flaws. I tried to intervene when I could. Changed the subject. Praised his strengths loudly enough to compete. Talked about his sense of humor. His memory for details. His ability to read people. Those things made Linda uncomfortable. You could see it in the way her smile tightened. Strengths she couldn't monetize didn't interest her. A few weeks after the fundraiser, we went to a small family dinner at my cousin Mark's house. Nothing formal. Just pizza and folding chairs in the living room. Ethan almost didn't come. He said he wasn't feeling well, which was his code for I don't want to be evaluated tonight. I told him he could stay home, but he shook his head. If I don't go, they'll talk about it, he said. At least if I'm there, I can hear what they say. That sentence hurt more than anything Linda had ever said into a microphone. At the dinner, conversation drifted the way it always did, circling back to the kids. College plans, sports, leadership programs. Linda sat across from Ethan, watching him in that quiet, assessing way she had. So, she sighed daft eventually, have you thought any more about what you want to do after high school? Ethan hesitated. I like computer stuff, he said. I'm thinking about IT or... Linda waved a hand gently. Those programs can be very demanding, she said. Lots of deadlines. The implication hung there. Mark's wife jumped in quickly. Not everyone's meant for high-pressure environments, she said, like she was being kind. Ethan nodded, eyes down. I guess. I felt something in me go cold and focused. Later that night, after we got home, Ethan went straight to his room. I heard his door close softly. I waited a few minutes, then knocked. Can I come in? I asked. He shrugged from his bed. Sure. His room was neat in that overly controlled way that comes from trying to keep your brain quiet. Everything had a place. Posters lined up evenly. His backpack hung on the same hook it always did. They don't think much of me, he said suddenly, not looking at me. I sat on the edge of the bed. Who? You know who. I did. I chose my words carefully because words had already done enough damage. What they think isn't the truth. He laughed, a short, humorless sound. Then why do they all agree? That question stayed with me long after he fell asleep. The next week, I had to go through some old files at home. Nothing dramatic. I was cleaning out a filing cabinet, trying to make room for tax documents. Years of paperwork blurred together. Utility bills. Insurance policies. Old lease agreements from when I'd helped my aunt and uncle with some administrative work years ago, back when I was still useful to them in small, unthreatening ways. One folder caught my attention because it didn't belong where it was. It was labeled with the name of the family business, the one everyone spoke about like it was a single, solid thing. Inside were copies of documents I vaguely remembered handling once, long ago, when Linda had asked me to organize a few things. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. I'd followed instructions, filed what I was told to file. Now, reading them again with fresh eyes, something felt off. The ownership structure wasn't as straightforward as Linda always implied. There were references to entities and clauses I didn't remember being explained. A name appeared more than once that hadn't come up in family conversations in years. My grandfather's. He died when Ethan was still little. He'd been quieter than Linda, less interested in performance. He'd liked Ethan. Not in a showy way. Just in the way he listened to him and didn't rush him. I didn't jump to conclusions. I don't do that. I copied the documents and put them back where I found them. Then I called a local attorney I'd worked with before for a facilities issue at work, someone practical and unflashy. I have a question, I said when we met, purely informational. She skimmed the papers, her expression neutral. Then she looked up at me. Who told you this was how it worked? She asked. I thought of Linda's smile. The microphone. The applause. No one, I said. They just assumed I wouldn't ask. The attorney leaned back slightly. There are some things here worth clarifying, she said carefully. That night, I sat at the kitchen table again, the house quiet around me. Ethan's door was closed. His light was off. I thought about how often people mistake silence for ignorance. How often they confuse calm with compliance. They had spent years teaching my son he wasn't built for responsibility. What they didn't realize was that I was built for patience. I didn't tell Ethan about the documents. Not yet. I've learned that kids carry information differently than adults do. What feels like preparation to us can feel like pressure to them. So I kept it to myself and moved carefully, the way you do when you're stepping across a floor you're not sure will creak. The attorney didn't give me answers right away. She asked questions instead. Who had always handled the business? Who signed leases? Who collected rent? Who made decisions? And who just spoke as if they did? I answered honestly. Linda and Robert were the faces. They hosted dinners, posed for photos, gave speeches. But over the years, I'd noticed that paperwork had a way of landing in other places first. My grandfather's name. An old accountant who'd retired quietly. A trust that no one ever talked about directly. People like to simplify stories when it benefits them, the attorney said. Ownership is rarely as simple as people make it sound. The family business, as Linda liked to call it, wasn't a shiny corporation or a generational empire. It was a handful of commercial rental units on the outskirts of town. A strip of low-rise buildings with a nail salon, a dry cleaner, a small insurance office, nothing glamorous, but steady. Reliable income, the kind of thing that quietly props up a lifestyle without drawing attention. Linda talked about it like it was hers by right, like she was the steward of something noble. At family gatherings, she'd refer to it as what we'll pass on to the kids. She said it casually, like a promise no one would dare question. The documents told a different story. There were conditions. Contingencies. Language that suggested the assets weren't meant to be wielded as leverage or rewards. The attorney didn't say much at first, just pointed out sections and asked if I'd noticed them before. I hadn't. Do you know if there's been any recent formal communication about beneficiaries? She asked. I thought of the fundraiser. The microphone. The careful phrasing. Not in writing, I said. Just announcements. She nodded slowly. Announcements can matter more than people think. That stuck with me. At home, Ethan continued to move through his days with that quiet, brittle determination. He did his homework without being asked. He triple-checked assignments before submitting them. He stopped joking around as much, like he was afraid humor would be mistaken for carelessness. One evening, I found him sitting at the kitchen table staring at his laptop, not typing. What's up? I asked. I'm trying to decide if I should sign up for student council, he said. They're taking applications. That sounds like something you'd be good at, I said. He frowned. Yeah, but I don't know if I should. I don't want to embarrass myself. Why would you embarrass yourself? He shrugged. What if I forget something? Or mess up? I leaned against the counter. Then you'd mess up. And the world would keep spinning. He looked unconvinced. That's not how it works for everyone. He wasn't wrong. A few days later, Linda called. I let it go to voicemail, then listened later while folding laundry. Hi, sweetheart, she said, voice syrupy. I just wanted to check in. Things have felt a little tense since the fundraiser, and I hate that. We're family, after all. She paused, as if expecting me to respond. I hope you know we only want what's best for Ethan, she continued. Structure, guidance, realistic expectations. Realistic, that word again. I didn't call her back. Instead, I sent another email to the attorney, attaching the fundraiser video Ethan had recorded. No commentary. Just the file. She called me the next morning. This is helpful, she said simply. Helpful how? I asked. In the way that clarity often is, she replied. It establishes intent. Intent, another word Linda would have hated. The attorney explained, carefully and without drama, that the way Linda and Robert had framed their announcement could be interpreted as a public exclusion tied to perceived capability. Depending on how the assets were structured, that mattered. Your grandfather was very specific, she said. He didn't want the business used to punish or reward children based on subjective judgments. I thought of him sitting at our kitchen table years ago, watching Ethan line up toy cars while everyone else talked over him. The way he'd waited until Ethan finished speaking before responding, even if it took a while. What happens now? I asked. She paused. That depends on how far you want to go. I didn't answer right away. That night, Ethan came home from school quieter than usual. He dropped his backpack by the door and went straight to his room. A few minutes later, I heard the low murmur of his voice through the wall. He was on the phone with someone. I don't know, he was saying. Maybe I shouldn't even try. When he came back out, his eyes were red. Bad day? I asked. He nodded. They picked candidates for the leadership workshop. I didn't make the cut. I'm sorry, I said. It's fine, he replied quickly. I mean, it makes sense. That doesn't make sense to me, I said. He shrugged. It does to everyone else. I watched him retreat again, the weight of other people's expectations pressing down on him in ways they'd never have to feel themselves. Later, after he went to bed, I sat with my laptop open, staring at the attorney's last email. She'd outlined options, formal inquiries, requests for documentation, steps that would start a process Linda and Robert believed they controlled. I wasn't angry, not in the way people expect. I was tired of watching my child bend himself smaller to fit into a narrative he didn't choose. Linda had always believed power was something you displayed. Something you spoke into a microphone. She'd never understood the kind that sits quietly in file cabinets and clauses and signatures. I closed my laptop without replying. Not yet. There was one more thing I needed to be sure of before I moved forward. One more assumption I needed to test. Because if I was going to do this, I wasn't going to do it loudly. I was going to do it correctly. The test came sooner than I expected. It was another family gathering, smaller this time, framed as casual. Linda texted the group chat about a Sunday lunch at her house, nothing formal, just catching up. I considered declining. I almost always did. But something in me wanted to see how far they were willing to go now that they'd said the quiet part out loud. Ethan didn't want to go. You don't have to, I told him, standing in the doorway of his room while he sat on his bed scrolling on his phone. You can stay here. He shook his head without looking up. If I don't go, they'll think it's because of me. That was the thing about kids like Ethan. They take responsibility for situations they didn't create. Linda's house was the same as always. Immaculate. Staged. A place where nothing ever felt lived in. Family photos lined the walls, carefully curated. Smiling faces, graduation caps, trophies. Ethan appeared in exactly 2 of them, both from years ago, both group shots where you had to look for him. Lunch was loud in that forced way, everyone talking over each other, laughing too quickly. Linda moved through the room refilling glasses, playing the role she loved most. Robert sat at the head of the table, nodding along, occasionally interjecting with commentary that sounded like conclusions rather than opinions. The conversation drifted, as it always did, toward the kids. Mark talked about college visits. Jenna mentioned a summer program. Linda listened, glowing. Then she turned to Ethan. So, she said, cutting her eyes toward him, how's school going? Ethan straightened. Okay, he said, I'm passing everything. Passing. Not excelling. Not leading. Just passing. That's good, she said, nodding slowly. We all have our strengths. The table went quiet for just a second. Robert smiled. Exactly, he added. Some people thrive in structured environments. Others need more guidance. Ethan's jaw tightened. I saw it happen. Linda leaned in, lowering her voice like she was sharing a secret meant for everyone. And that's why it's so important to be realistic, she said. We can't all expect the same outcomes. There it was. Not loud. Not cruel enough to be called out easily. Just enough to remind him of his place. Ethan pushed his chair back. Can I be excused? He asked, voice steady but thin. Of course, Linda said quickly. Didn't mean to overwhelm you. He disappeared down the hallway. No one followed. I stayed seated. I didn't fill the silence. I didn't smooth it over. After lunch, while everyone migrated to the living room, Linda cornered me near the kitchen. You know we worry about him, she said, lowering her voice. The world isn't kind to kids who can't keep up. I looked at her. He's keeping up just fine. She smiled, indulgent. You're his mother. You see potential. We see patterns. That sentence was meant to close the conversation. Instead, it opened something. On the drive home, Ethan stared out the window, arms crossed tight against his chest. They're right, he said eventually. I shouldn't aim for stuff I can't handle. I didn't respond immediately. I waited until we stopped at a red light, until I could look at him without having to split my attention. Who told you that? I asked. He shrugged. No one had to. That night, he didn't come out for dinner. I left a plate outside his door and heard him say thank you from the other side. When I went back to the kitchen, my phone buzzed. A text from Linda. I hope Ethan's okay. We only want to help. Help. Another word that meant control. I didn't reply. Instead, I pulled out the folder of copied documents and spread them across the table. I read them slowly this time, not skimming, not assuming I knew what they meant. The language was careful. Deliberate. My grandfather hadn't been flashy, but he'd been precise. There it was again. A clause tied to public declarations. Another tied to discriminatory framing. Language about equal access and protection from subjective exclusion. I felt my stomach drop, not with fear, but with recognition. This wasn't accidental. I emailed the attorney and asked a single question. If someone were to publicly frame a child as unfit or undeserving, would that qualify? Her reply came the next morning. Yes. One word. Clean. Final. At breakfast, Ethan finally emerged. He looked tired, dark circles under his eyes. I was thinking, he said cautiously, sitting across from me. Maybe I won't apply for any leadership stuff next year. It's probably not for me. Something in me hardened. Not against him. Against the idea that a room full of adults had convinced a teenager to shrink his future. You can decide what you want, I said carefully. But don't decide based on people who don't know you. He nodded, unconvinced. After he left for school, I sat alone at the table. The house was quiet. The papers lay in front of me, patient. Linda believed power came from being seen as reasonable, from saying just enough to sound fair. She'd underestimated two things. First, that my son would record the moment she tried to define him. Second, that my grandfather had planned for exactly this kind of person. By the time Linda realized she'd crossed from opinion into evidence, it would already be too late. And for the first time since the fundraiser, I allowed myself to think the thing I hadn't wanted to think before. They hadn't just humiliated my child. They'd handed me the key to stop it. I didn't rush. That was important. People like Linda are used to immediate reactions. Anger they can dismiss. Tears they can weaponize. Silence makes them uneasy, but only if it lasts long enough. So I kept living our routine. I packed Ethan's lunches. I asked about his classes. I listened when he talked about a game he was building in his spare time, the kind of slow, methodical project that calmed his mind. I didn't mention the documents. I didn't mention the attorney. I didn't mention Linda. At work, I asked for a personal day later that month and didn't explain why. I printed copies of emails and filed them the way I always did, labeling everything clearly. Dates matter, words matter, tone matters. The attorney called me in for a follow-up meeting. She had a way of speaking that didn't waste space. No drama. No speculation. Just facts laid out cleanly, like tools on a table. Your grandfather set this up to prevent exactly what's been happening, she said, tapping one section of the paperwork. He was very clear about not allowing the business to become a tool for favoritism or exclusion. I nodded. He never liked how Linda talked about potential, I said. He thought it was just another word for control. That tracks, she replied. She explained the structure in plain terms. The commercial properties were held under a limited liability company with operating agreements tied to a trust. Linda and Robert managed day-to-day operations, but they weren't the final authority they claimed to be. Their role depended on compliance with the trust's conditions. And those conditions were violated? I asked. She slid the fundraiser transcript across the table. She'd had it professionally transcribed. Publicly, she said. And on record. The words looked different on paper. Harder. More permanent. Not suited for responsibility. Different kind of support. Realistic expectations. I swallowed. What happens next? She didn't answer right away. She looked at me, assessing. That depends on your goal. I thought of Ethan at the kitchen table, rewriting the same paragraph until his hands shook. I want them to stop, I said. I want my son protected from this. She nodded. Then we proceed carefully. Carefully meant filings. Notices. Requests for clarification sent to the current trustees. It meant letting Linda and Robert explain themselves in writing. People who rely on implication don't do well when asked to be explicit. Once we submit, the attorney said, they'll know something is happening. That's fine, I replied. They just don't need to know it's coming from me. She raised an eyebrow. You're listed as an interested party. They'll figure it out. I know, I said. But they won't expect me to follow through. She smiled slightly. That's often the advantage. At home, the tension started to show in small ways. Linda called more frequently, left longer voicemails. Her tone shifted from concerned to annoyed. We're hearing you've been asking questions, she said in one message. I don't understand why you'd stir things up over a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding. Always that word. Robert texted once, a short message with no greeting. We need to talk. I didn't respond. Ethan noticed the change before I said anything. He always does. Why does Aunt Linda keep calling? He asked one evening. She's checking in, I said. He frowned. She never checks in. That night, he had trouble sleeping. I heard him pacing his room, the soft creak of floorboards giving him away. When I knocked, he opened the door almost immediately. Did I do something wrong? He asked. No. I said firmly. You didn't. They're mad, he said. I can tell. I took a breath and chose honesty without burden. They're uncomfortable, I said. That's not the same thing. He looked at me for a long moment. Are we in trouble? I shook my head. No. We're being careful. A few days later, the first letter went out. The attorney handled it. Formal, polite, requesting clarification regarding recent public statements about future beneficiaries and support structures. Linda called within hours. This is ridiculous, she said, her voice tight. You know what we meant. If you know what you meant, the attorney replied calmly, then it shouldn't be difficult to clarify in writing. Linda hung up on her. Robert tried a different approach. He showed up at my house unannounced one afternoon. I saw his car through the window and felt a familiar tightening in my chest, but I didn't panic. Panic gives people leverage. I opened the door and didn't invite him in. We need to fix this, he said, forcing a smile. You're blowing things out of proportion. I didn't say anything publicly, I replied. You did. He frowned. You know how Linda talks. Yes, I said. I do. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. You don't want to be responsible for tearing the family apart. I met his gaze. I'm not. He studied my face, searching for the version of me he was used to. The one who swallowed discomfort to keep the peace. The one who stayed in her lane. That version wasn't there. Think about Ethan, he said finally. I am, I replied. That's the point. He left without another word. The response from Linda and Robert came a week later. A carefully worded letter full of denials and reframing. They claimed no exclusion was intended, that their comments were general, that any interpretation otherwise was emotional. The attorney read it once, then set it aside. They've confirmed the issue, she said. How? I asked. By refusing to acknowledge impact, she replied, and by failing to retract the statements. The next step was inevitable. She filed notice that the trust's compliance review had been triggered, that the operating authority of the current managers was under examination. The language was dry, administrative, boring to anyone who didn't understand what it meant. Linda understood. Her voicemail that night was not calm. You think you're so smart, she hissed. You think paperwork makes you powerful. I listened to the message twice, then saved it. Paperwork doesn't make you powerful. It just reveals who already was. Once the review was triggered, things moved in a way that surprised even me. Not fast, exactly, but decisively. Like a machine that had been waiting for the right switch to be flipped. Linda stopped calling. That alone told me how serious it was. Robert sent one last text that simply said, "This is getting out of hand." I didn't reply. When people start talking about hands instead of facts, they've already lost control of the situation. The attorney explained the process in plain terms. The trust required an independent audit of recent actions and statements connected to the business. Not an investigation in the dramatic sense. No interrogations. Just a review of compliance with clearly written rules. Rules my grandfather had written on purpose. Linda and Robert were required to submit records. Emails. Meeting notes. Any communications related to future planning or beneficiary discussions. The trust didn't care about intentions. It cared about actions. And actions leave trails. At home, Ethan noticed the shift immediately. The absence of Linda's voice was almost louder than her presence had been. She hasn't called in a while, he said one night while we were cleaning up after dinner. I nodded. She's busy. With what? He asked. I considered how much to say. Answering questions, I replied. He was quiet for a moment. About me? About choices they made, I said. Not about you. That seemed to matter to him. He nodded slowly and went back to stacking plates. A week later, the first official notice went out. Linda and Robert were informed that their authority to make unilateral decisions regarding the business was temporarily suspended pending review. Temporary. That word set off panic. Linda showed up at my work this time. I was in the middle of a site walkthrough when the receptionist called my cell. There's a woman here asking for you, she said carefully. She says it's urgent. I knew before she finished the sentence. Linda stood in the lobby, perfectly dressed, arms crossed tightly against her chest. The smile was gone. This is embarrassing, she said the moment she saw me. Do you have any idea what people are saying? I looked around at the office staff pretending very hard not to listen. You shouldn't be here, I said quietly. She scoffed. Of course I should. You're my niece. That doesn't give you access to my workplace, I replied. Her eyes flashed. You've always been ungrateful. I felt oddly calm. What do you want? She stepped closer, lowering her voice. I want you to call your lawyer and tell her to stop this nonsense. I can't, I said. And even if I could, I wouldn't. She laughed, sharp and humorless. You think you've won something. I think you said something you can't take back, I replied. Her jaw tightened. We were protecting the business. From a kid? I asked. She didn't answer. Security appeared, summoned by someone who'd finally decided the tension wasn't normal. Linda straightened, plastered on a smile, and walked out without another word. That night, Ethan came home excited for the first time in weeks. He'd been selected for a small tech mentorship program through school. Nothing prestigious. Just a few hours a week with a local IT professional who'd volunteered. They said they liked how I explained my project, he said, eyes bright. They didn't care that I forgot a step. They just asked me to clarify. I smiled. That's because forgetting a step doesn't define you. He hesitated. Do you think Aunt Linda would think this counts as responsibility? I swallowed. What matters is that you do. The audit findings came in stages. The attorney shared updates as they arrived, never embellishing. Linda and Robert had repeatedly framed future access to business assets as conditional on subjective traits. Leadership. Fit. Readiness. None of which were defined in the trust. They'd also failed to document any objective criteria, relying instead on public statements and informal understandings. In other words, the attorney said, they treated the business like a reward system. And that violates the trust, I said. Yes. The next notice was more serious. The trust exercised its right to remove Linda and Robert from managerial roles entirely. I found out the same way they did. Through certified mail. Linda left a voicemail that night that sounded nothing like her usual composed self. "You did this," she said, voice shaking. "After everything we've done for you." I listened once and deleted it. Ethan didn't ask what was happening anymore. He could feel the ground shifting, even if he didn't know how. He seemed lighter, like a pressure he hadn't named was easing. One evening, he sat at the table working on his laptop and said, almost casually, "I think I want to apply for student council after all." I looked up. "Yeah?" He nodded. "I might not get it, but I want to try." "That sounds like you," I said. A month later, the final determination arrived. The trust concluded that Linda and Robert had breached their obligations. Their access to business income was terminated. Management was transferred to a neutral third party. But that wasn't the part that made my hands shake. The trust also moved to restructure future benefits. Linda had always assumed the business would eventually be passed down according to her preferences. The audit made that impossible. The attorney called me personally. "There's one more thing," she said. "What?" I asked. "Your grandfather included a provision for redistribution if the business was used to harm a minor beneficiary's well-being." I closed my eyes. "It's being invoked," she said. That night, as I tucked Ethan in, he asked me a question he hadn't asked in a long time. "Mom," he said softly, "am I actually okay?" I brushed his hair back. "Yes," I said. "You always were." He nodded, already half asleep. In the other part of town, Linda was probably pacing, trying to understand how something she thought she controlled had slipped through her fingers. She still believed this was personal. She still didn't understand the truth. This wasn't revenge. It was correction. Once the redistribution provision was invoked, the tone of everything changed. Up until then, Linda and Robert had treated the process like an argument they could eventually win. Something to negotiate. Something to spin. But redistribution meant the structure itself was shifting, not just the people in charge of it. It meant the rules they'd relied on were no longer theirs to bend. They panicked. The calls started again, this time from numbers I didn't recognize. Voicemails stacked up, alternating between outrage and desperation. "This is disproportionate," Linda said in one. "You're punishing us over semantics," Robert said in another. Semantics. As if words hadn't been the weapon from the start. I didn't respond. The attorney advised against it, but even if she hadn't, I wouldn't have. There's a point where engagement only feeds the belief that this is still a conversation. It wasn't. The trust appointed a professional management firm to take over the properties temporarily. Rent checks were redirected. Contracts reviewed. Long-standing, informal arrangements were questioned. Vendors who'd been loyal to Linda because she'd always been there suddenly had to deal with people who only cared about paperwork. Predictably, things Linda had been glossing over for years came to light. Deferred maintenance, favoritism towards certain tenants. Leases extended without proper review, nothing criminal, just sloppy. Entitled. The business had been treated like a family heirloom instead of a responsibility. At home, Ethan noticed how much quieter my phone had become. "They finally stopped," he said one evening while we were making dinner together. "For now," I replied. He glanced at me. "Are they mad at you?" "Yes," I said simply. He considered that. "Are you okay with that?" I didn't answer right away. I stirred the sauce slowly, watching it thicken. "I'm okay with you being okay," I said finally. That seemed to satisfy him. The next step came in the form of a thick envelope from the trust's legal office. I recognized the return address immediately. My hands were steady when I opened it, but my heart wasn't. The letter outlined the new structure. The business assets would no longer be passed down directly through family discretion. Instead, they would be placed into a long-term holding arrangement, with income distributed through purpose-specific trusts. Education, housing stability, healthcare support. Objective categories. No room for opinion. One of those trusts was designated for Ethan. Not as a reward, not as an inheritance he could lose by disappointing someone. As a protection. I read the letter twice, then sat back and stared at the wall. It wasn't about money, not really. The amounts were modest by some standards. Enough to matter. Not enough to corrupt. What mattered was the language. Ethan's name appeared without qualifiers. No mention of leadership. No mention of readiness. Just entitlement based on being who he was. Linda found out the same day. She showed up at my house that evening, pounding on the door like urgency could reverse legal filings. I didn't open it. I stood on the other side and listened. "You can't do this," she shouted. "You're stealing from our children." I didn't respond. "You're destroying everything your grandfather built," she cried. That one almost made me laugh. Eventually, she left. I watched her drive away from the window, shoulders rigid, head high. She still thought dignity came from posture. Ethan had heard everything. He stood at the end of the hallway, pale. "She's yelling about me," he said. "She's yelling about losing control." I corrected gently. He hesitated. "Did I cause this?" "No," I said firmly. "They did." That night, he slept better than he had in weeks. A few days later, the trust manager requested a meeting with me, Just informational, they said, to walk through how the new arrangement would work. They were efficient, professional, neutral. They explained how funds would be dispersed, what documentation would be required, how decisions would be reviewed. This isn't something anyone can take away, the manager said. Not without violating the trust. I nodded. That was the point. He glanced at his notes. Your grandfather was very clear about that. The fallout in the family was immediate and ugly. Group chats exploded. Accusations flew. People who'd laughed at the fundraiser suddenly claimed they'd been uncomfortable all along. Others doubled down, insisting Linda had only been telling the truth. I stayed out of it. Ethan, meanwhile, got elected to student council. Barely. He came home stunned. I didn't think they'd pick me, he said. They didn't, I replied. Your classmates did. He smiled at that. Linda tried one last angle a week later. She sent Ethan a message directly, bypassing me. We miss you. You know none of this was your fault. I blocked her number on his phone without comment. The attorney assured me it was the right move. Boundaries matter most when people pretend they don't. The final paperwork was filed at the end of the month. Linda and Robert were officially removed from any role related to the business. Their income from it ceased. They were given a grace period to adjust. They didn't take it well. Robert sent a message I didn't save. You've ruined us. I stared at the words for a long moment, then set the phone down. No, I thought. You ruined yourselves when you decided a child's worth was something you could announce into a microphone. That night, Ethan sat across from me at the kitchen table, working on his application essay for the mentorship program's next level. Can you read this? He asked. I want to make sure it makes sense. I read it carefully. It was thoughtful, honest, a little scattered, but sincere. It makes sense, I said. And it sounds like you. He smiled, just a little. In another house across town, Linda was probably still telling her version of the story. About betrayal, about ingratitude, about how unfair it all was. She would never tell the part about the fundraiser, or the lunch table, or the careful way she taught a boy to doubt himself. But that part was written down now. And unlike her speeches, it wasn't going anywhere. The quiet that followed felt unfamiliar at first. For weeks, my phone stayed still. No new voicemails. No surprise visits. No passive-aggressive texts disguised as concern. Linda and Robert had gone from omnipresent to absent, and the space they left behind felt strange, like a room after loud machinery shuts off. You don't realize how much noise there was until it's gone. Ethan noticed it too. They really stopped, he said one night, sitting on the couch with his laptop balanced on his knees. For now, I said again. He nodded, thoughtful. Do you think they'll start again? Probably, I replied. But not the same way. That was the truth. People like Linda don't disappear quietly. They regroup, they reframe. They look for angles that don't leave fingerprints. The trust manager warned me about that during our last call. They may attempt to challenge the restructuring, he said. Not successfully, but loudly. I'm used to loud, I replied. What I wasn't used to was watching my son relax into himself. He stopped asking for reassurance before every decision. He laughed more easily. He still struggled with focus, still lost track of time when he was deep into something he cared about, but the edge of fear that had sharpened everything was dulling. One afternoon, I came home to find him sprawled on the living room floor, papers scattered around him. What's all this? I asked. Campaign posters. He said, grinning. Student council wants us to put them up around school. I picked one up. It was simple. His name. A few words about listening and problem solving. Looks good, I said. He hesitated. Do you think it's too much? I smiled. I think it's enough. The family fallout, meanwhile, took on a life of its own. Distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly had opinions. Some reached out privately to say they'd always felt uncomfortable with how Ethan was treated. Others accused me of tearing apart something that should have stayed internal. Internal, in my family, had always meant unchallenged. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain. I let people believe whatever version made them most comfortable. The truth didn't need me to carry it anymore. Linda tried one last maneuver through a mutual cousin. She framed it as concern for Ethan's emotional well-being. She thinks all this attention might be overwhelming for him, my cousin said hesitantly over the phone. That maybe it would be healthier to ease off. I laughed once, short and sharp. She publicly singled him out at a fundraiser, I said. She doesn't get to worry about overwhelming him now. There was a pause. I figured you'd say that. My cousin replied. At school, Ethan's teachers started noticing changes too. His counselor emailed me to say he'd been participating more in class discussions. His mentor from the tech program praised his persistence. He doesn't give up easily, the mentor said during a check-in call. He just needs space to think. Space. That was all he'd ever needed. One evening, Ethan asked a question that caught me off guard. Do you think Grandpa planned all this? He asked, staring at the ceiling from his bed. I think he planned for people to show who they really were, I said carefully. And he planned for you to be protected when they did. Ethan was quiet for a long time. I wish he were still here. So do I said. A few weeks later, the trust issued a formal update to all named family parties. It outlined the final structure, the permanent removal of discretionary control, and the establishment of neutral oversight. Linda responded with a long email full of accusations and hurt feelings. I didn't read past the first paragraph. The attorney summarized it later. She's arguing that this was never about Ethan, she said. That this is about your resentment. I thought of Ethan's phone recording, the way his hand had dipped when the applause started. It was always about him, I said. The attorney agreed. The challenge Linda threatened never materialized. Not because she didn't want to fight, but because fighting required evidence she didn't have. She'd built her authority on implication and social pressure. Neither held up under review. By the end of the semester, Ethan stood on a small stage at school, nervously adjusting the microphone before addressing a room full of peers. He stumbled over his first sentence, paused, took a breath, and continued. I watched from the back, heart steady. No one laughed. No one clapped prematurely to rush him. They listened. When he finished, the applause was real. Not polite. Not relieved. Earned. Later that night, as we sat at the kitchen table, Ethan looked at me and said, I don't think I'm broken. I reached across and squeezed his hand. You never were. Across town, Linda was likely telling someone new how unfairly she'd been treated, how she'd only been trying to guide the family, how she'd been misunderstood. She could keep telling that story as long as she wanted. The one that mattered had already changed. And this time, my son wasn't just surviving it. He was standing in it. The first time Linda asked for help, it came wrapped in politeness so thin it barely held together. She didn't call me directly. She emailed. The subject line was neutral. Checking in. The body was longer. She wrote about how hard things had been lately, how unexpected changes had disrupted plans, how stressful it was to adjust at their age. She never mentioned the trust by name. Never mentioned Ethan. She framed everything as circumstance, as if control had simply slipped out of her hands through no fault of her own. Near the end, she wrote, family is supposed to support each other. I hope you remember that. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then closed my laptop without replying. Support had always flowed in one direction in my family. Downward. Conditional. Withdrawn the moment it became inconvenient. A week later, Robert tried a different approach. He left a voicemail that was almost reasonable. We're struggling, he said. This transition hit us harder than we expected. Maybe there's a way to talk. Talk. Another word they used when they meant undo. I forwarded the message to the attorney and asked if any response was required. No, she replied. You're not obligated to engage. That answer felt like permission I didn't know I'd needed. Ethan overheard part of the voicemail when it came in. He was sitting at the table working on homework, headphones, half on, half off. They sound scared, he said quietly. Yes, I agreed. Is that okay? He asked. I considered the question. It's not your responsibility, I said. And it doesn't change what happened. He nodded, thoughtful. I don't want them to hate me. They don't hate you, I said. They hate losing control. That distinction mattered. At school, things continued to improve in small, steady ways. Ethan didn't transform overnight. He still forgot assignments sometimes. Still got overwhelmed by noise. Still needed reminders. But he stopped assuming every mistake confirmed something terrible about himself. When he missed a deadline for student council paperwork, he went to the advisor and explained instead of shutting down. When a classmate interrupted him during a meeting, he didn't shrink back. He waited, then spoke again. Watching him do that felt like watching someone slowly straighten after years of hunching. The trust manager called with an update near the end of the month. Linda and Robert have requested a hardship review. He said. What does that mean? I asked. They're asking for temporary access to funds while they adjust, he explained. It's discretionary. And? I asked. There's no basis, he said. Their loss of income was a direct result of non-compliance. I exhaled slowly. So the answer is no. Yes, he confirmed. That night, Linda showed up at my house again. Not shouting this time, crying. I watched through the window as she stood on the porch, shoulders slumped, hair slightly out of place. She looked smaller than I remembered. Older. I opened the door but didn't invite her in. I never meant to hurt him, she said immediately, tears streaking down her face. I was just being honest. Honest about what? I asked. She hesitated. About his limitations. I felt something settle in my chest. Those are your limitations, I said quietly. Not his. She shook her head. You don't understand how the world works. I understand exactly how it works, I replied. I just refuse to let you define it for my child. She sobbed then, real sobs this time. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. I raised you, she said. You monitored me, I replied. There's a difference. She looked up, startled, like she'd never considered that interpretation. Please, she said. We need help. I shook my head. You need accountability. I closed the door gently but firmly. Ethan had been standing at the end of the hallway again. He looked shaken. She was crying, he said. Yes, I replied. Did I do that? He asked. No, I said firmly. She did. A few days later, News traveled through the family that Linda and Robert were downsizing, selling the house they'd hosted so many gatherings in, moving into something smaller, more manageable. People whispered about it like it was a tragedy. I didn't comment. The trust finalized its annual report shortly after. Everything was settled, structured, locked in. Ethan's educational trust was officially active. The paperwork was boring and clear. Limits, oversight, protections. No microphone required. On the night the confirmation email arrived, Ethan sat with me at the table while I read it. "Is that it?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "That's it." He smiled, then hesitated. "So they can't take it away?" "No," I said. "They can't." He leaned back in his chair, relief washing over his face in a way that made my throat tighten. For years, my family had treated worth like something provisional, something you earned by performing correctly. They'd taught my son to believe he was always one mistake away from losing everything. Now, that lie was gone. And all it had taken was letting them say exactly who they were out loud, on record, and without interruption. They thought they were setting boundaries. They were really signing their names to the consequences. Life didn't turn cinematic after that. There was no moment where everything snapped into place and stayed there. What changed was quieter and more durable. Ethan still had hard days. He still forgot his charger sometimes, still missed social cues, still got overwhelmed in crowded rooms. But the difference was that when those things happened, he didn't immediately look to me like he was waiting for confirmation that he'd failed. He'd look annoyed instead. Or tired. Or thoughtful. Those were upgrades. Linda and Robert faded into the background of our lives the way people do when they lose their audience. They stopped being referenced casually. Their names came up less often at family events, mostly followed by awkward silences or quick subject changes. People didn't know what to do with them now that the authority they'd always projected was gone. A few relatives tried to bridge the gap, suggesting reconciliation in vague terms. "They're still family," one cousin said carefully during a phone call. "They didn't mean for it to get this bad." I kept my voice even. They meant exactly what they said. That usually ended the conversation. The trust manager sent periodic updates, mostly procedural. Everything ran smoothly. The properties generated steady income. Oversight did what oversight is supposed to do when no one's trying to bend the rules. Ethan's trust remained untouched, exactly as intended. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't something he could access impulsively. It sat there quietly, like a locked door with a key that would only fit when the time was right. That was the kind of protection my grandfather had believed in. One afternoon, about a year after the fundraiser, Ethan came home from school with a letter in his hand. He stood in the doorway, staring at it like it might disappear. "I got into the summer program," he said. I smiled. "That's great. They said they liked my problem-solving approach," he added. "They said I don't panic when things don't work the first time." I laughed softly. "That's because you've had a lot of practice." He nodded, then hesitated. "Do you think Aunt Linda would finally be proud of me?" The question caught me off guard. Not because I didn't expect it, but because it reminded me how deep those hooks had gone. I chose my words carefully. "I think it's okay if she isn't," I said. "Pride from the wrong people can cost too much." He thought about that. Then he nodded. "I think I get that," he said. I saw Linda once more after that, by accident, at a grocery store across town. She looked different. Less composed. Her clothes still neat, but not carefully chosen. She saw me first and froze, like she hadn't planned for this moment. For a second, I considered pretending I hadn't seen her. Old habits die hard. Then I didn't. "Hi," I said, neutral. She swallowed. "Hi." We stood there between the produce and the canned goods, two people who used to orbit the same center and no longer did. "How's Ethan?" she asked finally. "He's well," I said. She nodded, eyes flicking away. "I'm glad." I didn't offer more. She didn't ask. When we parted, there was no closure, no apology, no dramatic exchange, just distance. Clean and intact. At home that night, Ethan sat at the table working on a coding project. He'd taken over the space where paperwork used to pile up. His notebooks were spread out, messy and alive. "What are you building?" I asked. "A scheduling tool," he said. "For people who forget stuff." I smiled. "That sounds useful." "Yeah," he said. "I think so too." Later, as I washed dishes, I thought about how close I'd come to letting everything slide. How easy it would have been to tell myself that Linda didn't mean harm, that Ethan would toughen up, that this was just how families were. That's the trap. Cruelty rarely announces itself. It hides behind tradition, behind concern, behind phrases that sound reasonable until you're the one they're aimed at. My family had always counted on my silence to keep things smooth. They'd mistaken my patience for permission. Ethan went to bed that night without asking if he'd done anything wrong that day. That alone told me everything I needed to know. The world didn't change. People didn't suddenly become kinder. But one boy stopped believing he was inherently less than. And one system designed to protect him did exactly what it was meant to do. Linda lost the ability to decide who mattered. Ethan gained the space to decide who he was. If that makes me the villain in someone else's story, I can live with that. Because in this one, my child is safe. And that was always the only ending I cared about. Time has a way of clarifying things once the noise dies down. By the time Ethan turned 17, the story everyone told about what happened had settled into something vague and distant. People stopped arguing about it because arguing required energy, and most of them had moved on to newer dramas. That was fine with me. I never needed agreement. I just needed distance. Ethan grew into himself slowly, the way people do when they're finally allowed to. He didn't suddenly become fearless or flawless. He still second-guessed himself sometimes. Still needed reminders. Still struggled on days when his brain felt like it was running too many tabs at once. But the difference was that he no longer interpreted those moments as evidence that he didn't belong. One afternoon, he came home from school and dropped his backpack by the door, grinning. "I got accepted," he said. "Accepted where?" I asked, though I already knew from the look on his face that this one mattered. "The applied tech program," he said. "They liked my portfolio. They said my project showed persistence." Persistence. Not leadership, not polish, not some vague idea of potential. Persistence. That night, as we sat at the kitchen table eating takeout, Ethan looked up at me and said, "You know, I used to think something was wrong with me. I waited. Like I was missing whatever everyone else had." He continued, "I don't think that anymore." My chest tightened, but I kept my voice steady. "I'm glad." He hesitated, then added, "I think they needed me to believe that." He was right. And hearing him say it himself felt like the final piece clicking into place. Linda and Robert never fully recovered their footing. They adjusted, downsized, rebranded their story to anyone who would listen. Sometimes I heard snippets through distant relatives. How they'd been blindsided. How things had been taken out of context. How unfair it all was. They never mentioned Ethan. That silence told me more than any apology ever could. The trust continued to function exactly as designed. Boring. Reliable. Untouchable. The kind of system people only notice when it stops them from doing what they want. Ethan's portion remained locked behind rules and safeguards. Not because he couldn't be trusted, but because no one else could be. That distinction mattered. On Ethan's last day of high school, he stood in the driveway in his cap and gown, fidgeting with the tassel like it might betray him if he didn't keep an eye on it. I took his picture, even though he pretended to hate it. "You ready?" I asked. He nodded. "Yeah?" Then he paused. "Hey, Mom?" "Yeah?" "Thanks for not letting them decide for me." I swallowed. "You did the hard part," I said. "I just made sure no one got in your way." At the ceremony, names were read. Applause rose and fell. When Ethan's name was called, he walked across the stage a little awkwardly, a little stiff, and completely himself. I clapped until my hands hurt. No one needed to frame it as anything other than what it was. Later that night, after the house quieted and Ethan went out with friends, I sat alone at the same kitchen table where so many decisions had been made. The surface was scratched now, worn in places. Lived in. I thought about how close I'd come to staying quiet. To telling myself it wasn't worth it. To choosing comfort over confrontation. But some confrontations don't need raised voices. They don't need speeches or ultimatums. They need records. They need patience. They need people willing to let others reveal themselves. My family believed power came from being seen as important, from standing at the center and deciding who belonged. They never imagined power could look like a mother reading fine print late at night, or a teenager pressing record on his phone because he thought it might matter later. It mattered. So if you're wondering whether I went too far, or whether I should have handled it differently, here's the truth. I didn't take anything from them that they didn't give up themselves. I didn't ruin the family. I just stopped letting them erase my child. And I would do it again.